The moment 19-year-old Private Emma Rodriguez collapsed under the weight of her tactical shield during the Nevada desert training exercise, Sergeant Major Bradley Thompson's harsh laughter echoed across the burning sand like a whip crack. "Maybe try the kitchen corpse, sweetheart," he sneered, completely unaware that the trembling recruit before him would soon become the only thing standing between 30 American soldiers and certain death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would rewrite every assumption the decorated combat veteran held about courage, strength, and what it truly means to be a warrior. The scorching July morning at Fort Carson Military Training Facility in Nevada began like any other grueling day of advanced combat preparation. The desert sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling compound, where America's newest recruits learned the harsh realities of modern warfare. Dust devils danced across the training grounds as drill sergeants barked orders at exhausted soldiers, pushing their bodies beyond perceived limits. Private Emma Rodriguez stood at the equipment station, her petite 5'2" frame dwarfed by the massive tactical riot shield she was attempting to lift. At barely 115 pounds soaking wet, Emma looked more like a college freshman than a soldier preparing for deployment. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, but wisps had escaped to frame a face that seemed too young and gentle for the brutal world of military combat. "Come on, Rodriguez," Corporal Jake Matthews called out impatiently. "We don't have all day. Grab your gear and move to formation." Emma wrapped her fingers around the shield's handles, feeling the weight of the 40-pound ballistic protection system strain against her shoulders and forearms. The other recruits in her unit had managed their equipment with varying degrees of success, but Emma's struggle was immediately apparent to everyone watching. The shield wobbled dangerously as she tried to maneuver it into position, her arms trembling with the effort of maintaining control. The advanced tactical shield was designed to stop rifle rounds and explosive shrapnel, its layered composite materials and steel reinforcement making it an essential piece of defensive equipment for urban combat operations. Sergeant Major Bradley Thompson approached the formation with the confident stride of a man who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and earned more commendations than most soldiers saw in their entire careers. At 42, Thompson was a legend among the training staff, known for his ability to transform soft civilians into hardened warriors through a combination of tough love and uncompromising standards. "What exactly is the holdup here?" Thompson demanded, his piercing blue eyes scanning the formation until they settled on Emma's obvious struggle with her equipment. "Private Rodriguez is having difficulty with her shield," Sergeant Matthews reported, his tone neutral but his expression suggesting this was becoming a pattern. Thompson's gaze fixed on Emma with the kind of intense scrutiny that made recruits wish they could disappear into the desert sand. He had seen thousands of young people attempt to become soldiers, and his experienced eye could usually identify those who wouldn't make it through advanced training within the first few days. "Rodriguez," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform, "show me your defensive stance." Emma attempted to assume the proper position, holding the shield at an angle designed to deflect incoming projectiles while maintaining mobility. However, the weight of the equipment, combined with her nervousness under Thompson's watchful eye, caused her to stumble slightly, the shield's edge scraping against the ground. A few snickers rippled through the formation as other recruits watched Emma struggle. Private Danny Walsh, a former high school football player from Texas, shook his head with barely concealed amusement. "This is going to be a long deployment if that's our defensive specialist," he muttered to his neighbor. Thompson stepped closer to Emma, his expression growing more stern as he evaluated her performance. "Private, this shield weighs 40 pounds. In combat, you'll be carrying it for hours while moving through hostile territory. Can you handle that responsibility?" Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended, though she tried to project confidence. "Yes, Sergeant Major, I can do it." "Show me," Thompson commanded. "Full combat shuffle, 50 yards down range and back. Let's see what you've got."
The combat shuffle required soldiers to move quickly while maintaining a defensive posture, keeping the shield positioned to protect vital areas while staying mobile enough to respond to changing tactical situations. For experienced soldiers, it was second nature. For Emma, it represented a test she wasn't sure she could pass. She began moving forward, trying to maintain the proper stance while fighting against the shield's unwieldy weight. Her steps were uneven, and the shield swayed with each movement, creating gaps in protection that would have been fatal in actual combat. "Faster, Rodriguez," Thompson barked. "Enemy fire doesn't wait for you to get comfortable." Emma attempted to increase her pace, but the additional speed only made controlling the shield more difficult. Her breathing became labored, and sweat began streaming down her face as the Nevada heat combined with physical exertion to push her body toward its limits. 20 yards into the exercise, disaster struck. Emma's foot caught on an uneven patch of ground, and the shield's momentum carried her off balance. She tumbled forward, the tactical equipment clattering against the dirt as she struggled to regain her footing. The formation erupted in barely suppressed laughter as Emma scrambled to retrieve her shield, dirt and sand clinging to her uniform. Her face burned with embarrassment as she realized that every member of her unit, along with several drill instructors, had witnessed her complete failure. Thompson's expression showed no sympathy as he approached the fallen recruit. "Rodriguez, get up. Try again." Emma struggled to her feet, lifting the shield with arms that already ached from the previous attempt. Her second try went no better than the first, with the heavy equipment proving too unwieldy for her to manage effectively while maintaining any semblance of tactical awareness. "Stop," Thompson commanded, after watching Emma stumble through another disastrous attempt.
The Sergeant Major turned to address the entire formation, using Emma's struggle as a teaching moment that would humiliate her while instructing the other recruits. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is exactly what gets soldiers killed in combat," Thompson announced, his voice carrying across the training ground. "The tactical shield is not a suggestion, it's not optional equipment, it's the difference between coming home alive and coming home in a box." Emma stood motionless, still holding the shield, but feeling completely exposed under Thompson's harsh critique and the judgmental stares of her fellow soldiers. "Private Rodriguez," Thompson continued, "you've just demonstrated every mistake that can be made with defensive equipment. Poor stance, inadequate strength, lack of mobility, and most importantly, a fundamental misunderstanding of what this gear represents." He gestured toward the shield in Emma's trembling hands. "This isn't just metal and composite materials. This is the trust that your fellow soldiers place in you to protect their lives when everything goes to hell. Can you handle that responsibility?" Emma's voice was barely audible when she responded, "I'll get better, Sergeant Major. I'll practice until I can do it right." Thompson's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Practice, Rodriguez? Some people are born for combat, and others are born for support roles. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations before they get someone killed." The words hit Emma like physical blows, each one reinforcing her growing sense that she didn't belong in this environment. Around her, the other recruits shifted uncomfortably, some feeling sympathy for her situation, while others agreed with Thompson's harsh assessment. "Maybe stick to administrative duties, sweetheart," Thompson said with finality. "Leave the combat roles to those who can actually handle them." Private Sarah Chen, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, stepped slightly forward. "Sergeant Major, maybe if we adjusted the training approach—" "Chen," Thompson cut her off sharply, "unless you want to join Rodriguez in questioning my training methods, I suggest you focus on your own performance." The formation fell silent as Thompson's authority reasserted itself over any impulse towards sympathy or alternative suggestions. Emma stood alone with her unwieldy shield, feeling the weight of failure and humiliation settling over her like the oppressive Nevada heat. What none of them knew, as they dismissed the struggling recruit and her apparent inability to master basic defensive equipment, was that Emma Rodriguez possessed something far more valuable than raw physical strength.
Hidden beneath her small frame and quiet demeanor was an intuitive understanding of protection and sacrifice that would soon prove more powerful than any amount of muscle or traditional military bearing. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around the formation as they prepared to move on to the next phase of training. Emma lifted her shield once more, her jaw set with quiet determination despite the mockery she had endured. She had enlisted to serve her country, and no amount of humiliation would change that fundamental purpose. As the unit marched toward their next exercise, leaving Emma to struggle with her equipment at the rear of the formation, none of them could have imagined that this same young woman would soon become their salvation in the most desperate moment any of them would ever face. 3 weeks before the humiliating shield incident that would define her reputation at Fort Carson, Emma Rodriguez had arrived at the Nevada training facility with dreams that seemed as vast as the desert surrounding the base. Her journey to this moment had been anything but conventional, shaped by circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits, but had forged in her an unshakable determination to serve. The cramped apartment in East Los Angeles where Emma had grown up bore little resemblance to the sprawling military installations she now calls home. The faded yellow walls of their 2-bedroom unit had witnessed countless nights of her studying by lamplight while her mother, Maria Rodriguez, worked double shifts as a nurse at Los Angeles General Hospital. Their neighborhood, where chain-link fences separated small houses and the distant hum of freeway traffic provided a constant backdrop, had taught Emma lessons about protection and vigilance that no military manual could capture.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maria Rodriguez had raised Emma and her younger brother Carlos as a single mother after their father disappeared when Emma was 12. The abandonment had devastated their small family financially and emotionally, but it had also revealed Maria's incredible strength and Emma's natural instinct to shield others from harm. "Mija," Maria would say during those difficult years, "sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand between the people you love and the things that want to hurt them." These words, spoken in their kitchen while Maria counted bills and worried about rent, would prove prophetic in ways neither of them could have imagined. Emma's protective instincts had manifested early and in unexpected ways. At 15, she had positioned herself between her younger brother and a group of older boys who were demanding his lunch money. Despite being outnumbered and physically smaller than her opponents, Emma had refused to move, absorbing their threats and even a few shoves until the boys grew frustrated and left Carlos alone. "Why didn't you just run?" Carlos had asked afterward, confused by his sister's willingness to face certain defeat. Emma had struggled to articulate what felt instinctive to her. "Because if I run, they hurt you. If I stay, maybe they hurt me, but at least you're safe." The logic seemed simple to her, though she couldn't explain why protecting others felt more important than protecting herself. High school had presented new challenges that further shaped Emma's character. While her classmates focused on typical teenage concerns like dating and social media, Emma found herself naturally gravitating toward roles that involved helping and protecting others. She volunteered as a crossing guard for elementary students, tutored struggling classmates without payment, and even worked part-time security at a local community center. The security job, which she had taken primarily to help with family finances, proved to be a revelation. Despite her small stature, Emma discovered an unusual ability to de-escalate conflicts and position her effectively to prevent violence. The community center's director, a former police officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Foster, who had retired to work with at-risk youth, noticed Emma's unique approach to security situations. "Most people think security means being intimidating," Foster had explained to Emma during one of their evening conversations. "But the best security personnel I've worked with understand that it's about positioning, awareness, and knowing how to use protection intelligently rather than just relying on force." Foster had served 2 tours in Iraq before retiring from the Army, and he recognized something in Emma's defensive instincts that reminded him of the best soldiers he had worked with overseas.
He began teaching her basic tactical concepts during slow periods at the community center, explaining how proper positioning and situational awareness could make a smaller person more effective than someone who relied purely on size and strength. Size isn't everything in combat, Foster would say while showing Emma how to use obstacles and terrain to her advantage. The smartest soldier is usually the one who goes home alive, not the biggest or strongest. These informal lessons planted the seeds of Emma's eventual decision to enlist in the military. Foster's stories of protecting civilians in dangerous situations resonated with something deep in her character, and she began to see military service as an extension of the protective instincts she had always felt. The decision to enlist had not come easily. Maria Rodriguez, who had worked so hard to provide stability for her children, was terrified at the prospect of her daughter entering military service. The evening Emma announced her intention to join the army, their small kitchen became the site of an emotional conversation that lasted until dawn. "Mija, you don't understand what war really means," Maria had pleaded, her nurse's experience having shown her too many young bodies broken by violence. "There are other ways to help people, ways that don't involve putting yourself in danger." Emma had tried to explain the calling she felt, the sense that her protective instincts could serve a larger purpose in the military. "Mom, remember when you used to say that the strongest thing you can do is stand between people you love and things that want to hurt them? That's what soldiers do, but for the whole country." The conversation revealed the depth of Emma's conviction, but also her family's fear for her. Carlos, now 17 and preparing for his senior year of high school, had been equally conflicted about his sister's decision. "Emma, you've always protected me," he had said during a private moment between the siblings, "but who's going to protect you?" The question haunted Emma even as she maintained her resolve to enlist. She understood her family's concerns, but she also felt a responsibility that extended beyond their small apartment and neighborhood. The attacks on September 11th, which had occurred when she was just 10 years old, had left a lasting impression on her young mind. She remembered watching the footage of first responders rushing toward danger to protect others, and she had known even then that she wanted to be someone who ran toward danger rather than away from it. Her recruitment process had been unconventional from the beginning. Staff Sergeant Michelle Williams, the recruiter who first met with Emma, had initially been skeptical about her potential for combat roles due to her size and quiet demeanor. Most successful recruits project confidence and aggression, while Emma's strength seemed to come from a different source entirely. "What interests you about military service?" Williams had asked during their first meeting at the recruitment office in downtown Los Angeles. Emma's answer had been immediate and heartfelt. "I want to protect people. I've always been good at putting myself between problems and people who might get hurt. I think I could do that on a bigger scale in the Army." Williams had administered the standard battery of tests and evaluations, and while Emma's physical scores were modest, her psychological profiles revealed unusual characteristics. Her aptitude tests showed exceptional spatial reasoning and tactical thinking, particularly in scenarios involving defensive positioning and threat assessment. "You have an interesting profile," Williams had told her after reviewing the results. "Your physical capabilities are adequate, but not exceptional. However, your mental approach to protection and defensive scenarios is quite remarkable." The recruiter had recommended Emma for advanced training programs, suggesting that her unique combination of protective instincts and tactical thinking might make her valuable in specialized roles. Emma had accepted the assignment to Fort Carson's Advanced Combat Training Program with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. Her arrival at the Nevada facility had been overwhelming in every possible way. The vast desert landscape, the imposing military structures, and the intense atmosphere of constant training created an environment unlike anything she had experienced in Los Angeles. Her fellow recruits came from diverse backgrounds, but most shared a certain aggressive confidence that Emma found intimidating. Private Danny Walsh, the former football player from Texas, represented everything Emma felt she was not. At 6 feet tall and 200 pounds of muscle, Danny moved through the training environment with natural ease and obvious physical capability. His loud voice and commanding presence made him an instant leader among the recruits, while Emma often found herself struggling to be heard or noticed.
Private Sarah Chen, a former college athlete from Oregon, had initially seemed like a potential ally for Emma. Sarah was smaller than many of the male recruits, but possessed obvious athletic ability and a competitive drive that helped her excel in most training exercises. However, even Sarah's encouragement couldn't mask her surprise at Emma's struggles with basic equipment handling. "Emma, maybe if you spend more time in the weight room," Sarah had suggested after watching one of Emma's unsuccessful attempts to manage her tactical gear. "You've got the heart for this, but you need to build up your physical capabilities." The advice was well-meaning, but missed the fundamental challenge Emma faced. This wasn't simply about physical strength, though that was certainly part of the equation. Emma was discovering that military training emphasized individual capability and aggressive action, while her natural instincts focused on positioning herself to protect others and using defensive tactics rather than offensive force. Corporal Jake Matthews, their primary instructor for equipment training, had grown increasingly frustrated with Emma's performance during the weeks leading up to her public humiliation with the shield. Matthews was a competent soldier who took pride in preparing recruits for the harsh realities of combat. But he interpreted Emma's struggles as a lack of commitment rather than a mismatch between her natural abilities and traditional training methods. "Rodriguez, I don't understand what's happening here," Matthews had said during a private conversation after another disappointing training session. "Your written tests show you understand the concepts, but when it comes to practical application, you fall apart. Are you sure you're committed to this?" Emma's response had been quiet but determined. "I am committed, Corporal. I know I can do this. I just need to find the right approach." Matthews had shaken his head with frustration. There is no right approach other than following instructions and executing properly. This isn't about finding your comfort zone. This is about meeting military standards. The conversation highlighted a fundamental disconnect between Emma's learning style and the standardized training methods used at Fort Carson. While other recruits seemed to thrive under the pressure of aggressive instruction and competitive environments, Emma performed better when she could understand the protective purpose behind each technique and practice in a way that built confidence rather than induced stress. Lieutenant Colonel Foster's informal lessons at the community center had been conducted in a supportive environment where Emma could ask questions and experiment with different approaches. At Fort Carson, the pace was relentless and the expectations were uniform, leaving little room for individual learning styles or alternative methods. The night before her humiliating encounter with Sergeant Major Thompson, Emma had lain awake in her narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of the Nevada desert and questioning whether she had made a terrible mistake in enlisting. Her bunkmate, Private Ashley Morgan from Alabama, had already proven herself capable in most training exercises and seemed genuinely puzzled by Emma's continued struggles. "Emma," Ashley had whispered in the darkness, "maybe you should consider requesting a transfer to a support role. There's no shame in finding where you fit best in the military." The suggestion had been kindly meant, but it struck at Emma's deepest fears about her place in the military and her ability to fulfill the protective role she had envisioned for herself. She understood that her fellow recruits were beginning to see her as a liability rather than an asset, and she worried that their assessment might be correct. What Emma couldn't have known as she struggled with self-doubt in the desert darkness was that her unconventional approach to protection and her instinctive understanding of defensive positioning were about to be tested in a way that would reveal their true value. The traditional military training that emphasized individual aggression and offensive capability was preparing her classmates for one type of combat. But Emma's protective instincts were developing capabilities that would prove far more crucial when survival depended not on attacking enemies, but on shielding allies from harm. The morning sun rose over Fort Carson, bringing with it the day that would change everything Emma thought she knew about her place in the military and her value as a soldier. As she prepared for another day of training, Emma carried with her the weight of weeks of failure and humiliation, unaware that she was about to discover that true strength sometimes looks nothing like what people expect to see.
The weeks following Emma's public humiliation with the tactical shield transformed into a grueling period of self-imposed training that pushed her body and spirit to their absolute limits. While her fellow recruits enjoyed their limited free time playing cards, writing letters home, or catching up on sleep, Emma could be found in the equipment yard during every available moment, wrestling with the same 40-pound shield that had become both her nemesis and her obsession. The Nevada desert's temperature extremes became Emma's training partners. In the pre-dawn hours, when frost still clung to the metal surfaces of military equipment, she would begin her solitary practice sessions. The cold made the shield's handles feel like ice against her bare hands, but the physical discomfort seemed insignificant compared to the burning determination that had replaced her earlier self-doubt. "Rodriguez, what the hell are you doing out here?" Private Danny Walsh had discovered Emma during one of his early morning runs, finding her silhouetted against the desert sunrise as she practiced defensive movements with methodical precision. Emma paused in her training, sweat already beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "Working on my shield techniques, Walsh. I'm not giving up on this." Danny shook his head with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "Look, I respect the dedication, but Thompson already wrote you off. Maybe it's time to accept that some people aren't cut out for combat roles." The suggestion ignited something fierce in her eyes. Maybe some people are wrong about what combat really requires. Danny jogged away, leaving Emma alone with her shield and her unwavering resolve. What he couldn't understand, and what Emma was beginning to discover through her solitary training, was that traditional approaches to combat preparation weren't designed for someone with her unique combination of strengths and limitations.
Emma had begun studying military history during her evening hours, particularly focusing on defensive tactics and siege warfare. The base library, largely ignored by recruits who preferred more immediate forms of entertainment, became her second home as she researched historical examples of smaller forces successfully defending against overwhelming odds. The ancient Greek phalanx formation particularly fascinated her. She read about how disciplined soldiers with overlapping shields could withstand cavalry charges and protect each other through coordinated defensive positioning. The concept resonated with her protective instincts and suggested possibilities that modern military training seemed to overlook. Captain Rebecca Martinez, the base librarian and a former intelligence officer, had noticed Emma's unusual research interests and approached her during one late evening study session. "Interesting reading material, Private Rodriguez," Martinez observed, noting the stack of books on defensive tactics and military engineering surrounding Emma's study area. Most recruits focus on offensive capabilities and individual combat skills. Emma looked up from a detailed analysis of medieval castle defense strategies. "I'm trying to understand how smaller forces can protect larger ones, Captain. It seems like there should be applications for modern combat situations." Martinez settled into the chair across from Emma, her interest genuine. "What specifically are you looking for?" The question opened a floodgate of thoughts Emma had been developing through weeks of private study and training. Traditional combat training emphasizes individual strength and aggressive action, but what if the real key to protection is understanding positioning, angles, and how to use defensive equipment as a force multiplier rather than just personal protection? Captain Martinez's eyebrows rose with surprise. Emma's question revealed a level of tactical thinking that was sophisticated beyond what she would have expected from a struggling recruit. "Give me an example," Martinez encouraged. Emma pulled out a notebook where she had been sketching defensive formations and equipment modifications. "The tactical shield we use weighs 40 pounds and is designed to protect one person. But what if you could position multiple shields to create overlapping protection for a larger group? What if the weight that makes it difficult for one person to carry could be an advantage when you're creating a stationary defensive position?" The concept was innovative and demonstrated that Emma's struggles with traditional training weren't due to lack of intelligence or tactical understanding. Instead, she was thinking about combat problems in ways that didn't align with standard individual-focused military doctrine. "Have you discussed these ideas with your instructors?" Martinez asked. Emma's expression darkened slightly.
Corporal Matthews says there's only one right way to use equipment, and Sergeant Major Thompson has already decided I'm not suited for combat roles. I don't think they'd be interested in alternative approaches. Martinez recognized the frustration of a creative mind being constrained by rigid institutional thinking. Her own intelligence background had taught her to value unconventional approaches to complex problems. Private Rodriguez, would you be interested in some additional training opportunities? I have contacts in specialized units who might appreciate your perspective on defensive tactics. The offer was unexpected and potentially transformative, but Emma hesitated. Captain, I appreciate the suggestion, but I need to prove myself in basic training first. If I can't handle the standard requirements, I don't deserve special opportunities. Martinez respected Emma's integrity, but she also recognized wasted potential when she saw it. Sometimes the military's greatest assets don't fit into standard categories, Private. Keep studying, keep training, and stay open to possibilities. Emma's private training sessions had evolved beyond simple shield handling to incorporate complex movement patterns that incorporated her historical research. She began practicing what she privately called protection zones, positioning techniques that would allow one person with a shield to protect multiple people from different angles of attack. The physical demands of her self-imposed training regimen were brutal. Emma's hands became covered with calluses from gripping the shield's handles for hours at a time. Her shoulders and back ached constantly from the repeated stress of maneuvering the heavy equipment. Most concerning, she had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her already small frame becoming even more delicate as she pushed her body beyond its natural limits. Private Sarah Chen had grown increasingly worried about Emma's obsessive training habits and tried multiple times to convince her to ease up on her self-punishment. "Emma, you're going to hurt yourself," Sarah warned during one evening conversation in their barracks. "I found you asleep standing up against your shield yesterday morning. This isn't sustainable." Emma's response was quiet but firm. "I can't afford to be sustainable, Sarah. I either figure this out or I fail everyone who believes in me." The everyone Emma referenced was a small but important group. Her mother, Maria, called every week, her voice filled with worry and encouragement in equal measure. Her brother, Carlos, sent letters describing his senior year achievements and expressing pride in his sister's service. Lieutenant Colonel Foster from the community center had written several times, sharing tactical insights and reminding Emma that true strength often looked different than people expected. Most significantly, Emma had begun receiving unexpected support from some of the base personnel who had observed her dedicated training efforts. Sergeant Angela Phillips, who supervised evening equipment maintenance, had started leaving small improvements for Emma's shield: better grip tape, padding adjustments, and balance modifications that made the equipment slightly more manageable for someone of her size. "Don't tell anyone I helped," Phillips had whispered during one equipment check, "but I respect someone who refuses to quit, even when everyone else has given up on them." Technical Sergeant David Kim, who managed the base's engineering workshop, had also taken notice of Emma's training dedication. Kim had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and understood that innovation often comes from soldiers who faced limitations that forced them to think creatively. "Rodriguez," Kim had said during one chance encounter, "I've been watching your training sessions. You're approaching shield work differently than anyone I've seen. Have you considered that might be an advantage rather than a problem?" Emma had looked at him with surprise. "How could struggling with basic equipment be an advantage, Sergeant?" Kim's response had planted seeds of confidence that would prove crucial in the days ahead. "Because you're learning to work with the equipment in ways that others never have to consider. When the real test comes, that extra knowledge might be exactly what saves lives." The comment had energized Emma's training efforts, suggesting that her unconventional approach might have value that others couldn't see. She began documenting her techniques and observations, creating a personal manual of defensive tactics that drew from historical research, practical experimentation, and her own protective instincts. Emma's training had also attracted the attention of some personnel who viewed her efforts less favorably. Sergeant Major Thompson made a point of walking past her training area whenever possible, his expression conveying clear disapproval of what he saw as wasted effort and misplaced determination.
"Rodriguez," Thompson had said during one particularly visible training session, "you're embarrassing yourself and wasting everyone's time. Accept reality and move on to something you can actually handle." The public criticism stung, but it also strengthened Emma's resolve. She had begun to understand that proving herself would require more than just meeting Thompson's expectations. It would require demonstrating value in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Private Ashley Morgan, Emma's bunkmate, had become an unwilling witness to the physical and emotional toll of Emma's training obsession. Ashley watched Emma return to their barracks each evening exhausted, bruised, and often discouraged, only to wake before dawn and repeat the process. "Emma," Ashley had said during one particularly difficult evening, "what are you really trying to prove, and who are you trying to prove it to?" The question forced Emma to examine her motivations more deeply than she had been willing to do. Was she training to prove her worth to Thompson and the other skeptics? Was she trying to live up to some impossible standard? Or was she preparing for something more important that she couldn't yet fully articulate? "I'm trying to prove that protection doesn't look the way people think it should," Emma had finally answered. "I'm trying to prove that being small and careful and thinking differently can be just as valuable as being big and strong and aggressive." Ashley had nodded with understanding, though she remained concerned about the cost of Emma's single-minded pursuit of vindication. As Emma's weeks of private training continued, subtle changes began to appear in her overall performance. Her coordination improved dramatically as she learned to work with her shield's weight rather than fighting against it. Her endurance increased as her body adapted to the demanding physical requirements. Most importantly, her confidence grew as she developed techniques that played to her strengths rather than highlighting her limitations. The base's other instructors began to notice these improvements, though most attributed them to natural progression rather than recognizing the innovation behind Emma's development. Corporal Matthews noted that Emma's equipment handling had become more efficient, though he maintained his skepticism about her overall combat readiness. "Rodriguez is getting better with basic techniques," Matthews reported to Thompson during a routine training review, "but she's still not ready for advanced tactical scenarios." Thompson's response was predictably dismissive. "Improvement from terrible to mediocre is still mediocre. Don't mistake effort for capability." What neither Matthews nor Thompson realized was that Emma's improvement represented something far more significant than gradual progress towards standard military competence. She was developing a completely different approach to defensive combat that would soon prove its worth in the most desperate circumstances any of them could imagine. The desert wind that whistled through Fort Carson each evening seemed to carry whispers of coming change. Emma's weeks of preparation were building towards something larger than personal vindication or proving skeptics wrong. Her unconventional training was preparing her for a moment when traditional military approaches would fail, and when her unique understanding of protection and sacrifice would become the difference between life and death for 30 American soldiers. As Emma completed another solitary training session under the Nevada stars, she couldn't have known that her time for preparation was nearly over. The real test was approaching, a test that would validate every hour of struggle, every moment of doubt, and every innovative technique she had developed through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in her calling to protect others. The emergency briefing room at Fort Carson buzzed with an energy that Emma had never experienced during her months of training. At 300 hours on a cold October morning, 32 recruits found themselves assembled for what their instructors described as their final field exercise before graduation. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast sharp shadows across tired faces, as soldiers who had been roused from sleep tried to process the gravity of what they were about to undertake. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the base commander, who rarely involved herself directly in recruit training, stood at the front of the room with the kind of stern expression that immediately commanded attention. Her presence alone indicated that this exercise would be unlike the routine training scenarios they had completed throughout their time at Fort Carson.
"Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Hendricks began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had led troops through actual combat situations, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. This information does not leave this room under any circumstances." Emma felt her pulse quicken as she looked around the room at her fellow recruits. Danny Walsh sat straighter in his chair, his competitive instincts clearly engaged by the promise of a challenging exercise. Sarah Chen leaned forward with obvious interest, while Ashley Morgan looked nervous about what they might be asked to do. Intelligence sources have identified a terrorist cell operating from a compound approximately 60 miles northeast of this facility. The cell has been using the remote location to plan attacks against civilian targets in major American cities. The briefing room fell completely silent as the recruits absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't a simulated exercise with fake enemies and predetermined outcomes. They were being asked to participate in an actual military operation with real-world consequences. Sergeant Major Thompson stepped forward to provide tactical details, his expression more serious than Emma had ever seen it. The compound is located in mountainous terrain that provides natural defensive advantages for the occupants. Intelligence suggests approximately 15 to 20 armed individuals with military-grade weapons and possibly explosive devices. Emma's mind immediately began analyzing the tactical challenges they would face. Mountains meant limited approach routes and potential ambush points. Armed defenders with military weapons meant they would be outgunned if discovered. The mention of explosive devices suggested that even successful infiltration might not guarantee safe extraction.
The informant, codenamed Phoenix, has been providing intelligence for the past 6 months, Thompson continued. Phoenix's last communication indicated that the cell suspects infiltration and plans to relocate within 72 hours. This mission represents our last opportunity to extract Phoenix and gather crucial intelligence about planned attacks. Captain Martinez, who had become an unexpected ally during Emma's library research sessions, added operational context that made the mission's importance clear. Phoenix has provided information that has already prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks. The intelligence this individual possesses could save hundreds or thousands of civilian lives. The weight of responsibility settled over the assembled recruits like a physical force. They were no longer training to become soldiers. They were being asked to act as soldiers in a situation where failure could have devastating consequences for innocent people. Lieutenant Morrison, who would serve as their field commander, began outlining the operational plan. "We'll approach the compound in 3 teams. Alpha Team will establish perimeter security and provide overwatch. Bravo Team will conduct the actual infiltration and extraction. Charlie's team will serve as quick reaction force and handle emergency evacuation if needed." Emma listened carefully as Morrison assigned personnel to each team, noting the logic behind the selections. Danny Walsh and the other physically imposing recruits were assigned to Alpha Team, where their strength and aggression would be valuable for establishing security. Sarah Chen and the most tactically proficient soldiers were placed in Bravo Team for the complex infiltration operation. "Rodriguez," Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that made Emma's stomach clench with anticipation, "you'll be assigned to Charlie Team as defensive specialist." The assignment felt like both recognition and dismissal. Charlie's team was essential for mission success, but Emma understood that her role was based more on her unsuitability for other functions than on confidence in her unique capabilities. She would be part of the backup plan rather than the primary operation. Sergeant Major Thompson's expression when Morrison announced Emma's assignment confirmed her interpretation. Thompson clearly viewed her inclusion in the mission as a necessary risk rather than a valuable asset, and his reluctance was obvious to everyone in the room. Equipment loadout will be determined by team assignment. Charlie's team will carry defensive equipment, including tactical shields, medical supplies, and emergency extraction gear. Your primary responsibility will be establishing secure positions and providing protection if the primary teams encounter complications. Emma felt a familiar mixture of determination and apprehension as she contemplated her role in the mission.
The tactical shield that had been the source of so many humiliating training failures would now be essential equipment for a real-world operation where lives depended on her performance. The briefing continued with detailed maps, communication protocols, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during the operation. Emma studied every detail with the intensity she had brought to her historical research, understanding that preparation could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Weather conditions are expected to be challenging, Corporal Matthews added to the operational briefing. The temperature will drop below freezing after sunset, and there's a possibility of snow. Visibility may be limited, which could work to our advantage for infiltration, but will complicate navigation and communication. The mention of difficult weather conditions reminded Emma of her pre-dawn training sessions in the Nevada desert. The cold that had made her shield's handles feel like ice might actually be an advantage now, as she had learned to work effectively with equipment under uncomfortable conditions. Master Sergeant Kelly Rodriguez, no relation to Emma despite sharing a surname, provided intelligence updates about the terrorist cell's known capabilities. These individuals have military training and combat experience. They've demonstrated proficiency with advanced weapon systems and show sophisticated understanding of defensive positioning. Emma absorbed this information with particular interest, recognizing parallels between the terrorists' defensive advantages and the historical siege warfare she had studied. Her research into how smaller forces could defend against larger ones might be relevant in unexpected ways if the mission encountered complications. Time schedule is critical, Colonel Hendricks emphasized as the briefing neared its conclusion. Phoenix's last communication indicated that the cell plans to abandon this location within 3 days. We have one opportunity to extract our assets and gather intelligence before they disappear into a network that could take years to penetrate again. The finality of this timeline added pressure that Emma could feel affecting everyone in the room. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to learn from mistakes and try again. Success or failure would be determined by their performance during a single operation. Equipment loadout will be determined by team assignment, Morrison continued. Charlie's team will carry defensive equipment, including tactical shields, medical supplies, and emergency extraction gear. Your primary responsibility will be establishing secure positions and providing protection if the primary teams encounter complications. Emma felt a familiar mixture of determination and apprehension as she contemplated her role in the mission. The tactical shield that had been the source of so many humiliating training failures would now be essential equipment for a real-world operation where lives depended on her performance. The briefing continued with detailed maps, communication protocols, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during the operation. Emma studied every detail with the intensity she had brought to her historical research, understanding that preparation could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Weather conditions are expected to be challenging, Corporal Matthews added to the operational briefing. The temperature will drop below freezing after sunset, and there's a possibility of snow. Visibility may be limited, which could work to our advantage for infiltration, but will complicate navigation and communication. The mention of difficult weather conditions reminded Emma of her pre-dawn training sessions in the Nevada desert. The cold that had made her shield's handles feel like ice might actually be an advantage now, as she had learned to work effectively with equipment under uncomfortable conditions. Master Sergeant Kelly Rodriguez, no relation to Emma despite sharing a surname, provided intelligence updates about the terrorist cell's known capabilities. These individuals have military training and combat experience. They've demonstrated proficiency with advanced weapon systems and show sophisticated understanding of defensive positioning. Emma absorbed this information with particular interest, recognizing parallels between the terrorists' defensive advantages and the historical siege warfare she had studied. Her research into how smaller forces could defend against larger ones might be relevant in unexpected ways. Time schedule is critical, Colonel Hendricks emphasized as the briefing neared its conclusion. Phoenix's last communication indicated that the cell plans to abandon this location within 3 days. We have one opportunity to extract our assets and gather intelligence before they disappear into a network that could take years to penetrate again. Equipment check and final preparations begin at 0600 hours. Transport departs at 1400 hours. Mission commencement is scheduled for 2200 hours to take advantage of darkness for approach and infiltration. As the briefing concluded and recruits began filing out of the room to prepare for the mission, Emma found herself approached by several unexpected sources of encouragement and concern. Technical Sergeant Kim, who had noticed her innovative training techniques, pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Rodriguez, this is your chance to show that different approaches to defense can be just as valuable as traditional tactics. Trust your instincts and remember that protection is about more than just following standard procedures." Captain Martinez also sought her out, offering both tactical advice and personal support. "Emma, you've developed techniques that others haven't considered. Don't let anyone convince you to abandon approaches that you know work. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who think differently." Even Sergeant Phillips, who had quietly supported Emma's training, provided encouragement disguised as equipment advice. "Your shield modifications have been tested under the most demanding conditions anyone could face. Trust your preparation and remember that protection sometimes requires sacrifices that others aren't willing to make." However, not all the attention Emma received was supportive. Sergeant Major Thompson made a point of speaking with her privately, and his message was very different from the encouragement he had received from others.
"Rodriguez," Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and barely concealed frustration, "this mission is too important for experimentation or proving points. Follow orders exactly. Stay out of the way when real soldiers are working, and don't let personal ambition interfere with mission success." The warning stung, but it also strengthened Emma's resolve to prove that her unconventional approach to defense could contribute meaningfully to mission success. She understood that Thompson's skepticism was based on legitimate concerns about untested tactics in high-stakes situations, but she also believed that her preparation had value that others couldn't recognize. As Emma prepared her equipment for the mission, she incorporated modifications and techniques developed during her weeks of solitary training. Her shield bore improvements that Sergeant Phillips had quietly provided, and her gear arrangement reflected lessons learned from historical research and practical experimentation. Private Ashley Morgan, who would be serving an Alpha team, expressed both excitement and concern about the upcoming operation. "Emma, I'm nervous about all of us being split up for this mission. We've been training together for months, and now we're going into a real situation without our usual support systems." Emma understood Ashley's concern, but she also felt a sense of anticipation that surprised her. "Ashley, this is what we've been preparing for. Everything we've learned, all the training we've completed, it's all been leading to this moment when we can actually protect people and serve our country." The conversation reminded Emma of her original motivation for enlisting, the desire to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. The terrorist cell they were being asked to stop represented exactly the kind of threat she had always wanted to help prevent. Danny Walsh, who had initially been dismissive of Emma's capabilities, approached her with unexpected seriousness as final preparations continued. "Rodriguez, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye about training and capabilities, but we're all in this together now. Whatever happens out there, we've got each other's backs." The gesture of solidarity meant more to Emma than Danny could have realized. Despite their differences in size, strength, and approach to military service, they shared a commitment to mission success and protecting their fellow soldiers that transcended personal conflicts. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Nevada horizon, 32 recruits prepared to embark on their first real military operation. For Emma Rodriguez, the mission represented not just a test of her training and preparation, but validation of her belief that protection could take many forms, and that strength wasn't always measured in conventional ways.
The terrorist compound waiting in the mountains held secrets that could save countless lives, but reaching those secrets would require every soldier to perform at their absolute best. Emma's role as defensive specialist might keep her away from the primary action, but she carried with her innovations and insights that would soon prove more valuable than anyone could have predicted. The transport vehicles that would carry them toward their date with destiny waited in the motor pool, their engines warming in the desert air. Emma Rodriguez, the recruit who had been mocked for her failed grenade throw and dismissed as combat worthless, was about to discover that her unconventional path had prepared her for a moment when traditional military training would fail, and when her unique understanding of protection would become the salvation of every soldier under her care. The mountain air cut through their tactical gear like frozen blades as Charlie's team established their overwatch position on the rocky outcropping 200 meters from the terrorist compound. Emma's breath formed visible clouds in the sub-zero temperature, and despite her months of desert training, the altitude and cold presented challenges she hadn't fully anticipated. The compound below them looked deceptively quiet, its scattered buildings dark against the snow-covered ground that had begun falling an hour after their arrival. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through their communication headsets with updates from Alpha and Bravo teams. Phoenix extraction proceeding on schedule. Target building identified. Charlie team, maintain overwatch and be prepared for emergency extraction protocols. Emma adjusted her position behind a cluster of boulders, her tactical shield propped against the rocks to provide additional protection while allowing her to monitor the approach routes to their position. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, the Charlie team leader who shared Emma's surname, had positioned their 8-person unit to cover multiple escape routes while staying hidden from compound surveillance. Rodriguez, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez whispered, the shared name creating momentary confusion that had become routine during their deployment. Adjust your sector to cover the eastern approach. Intelligence suggests that's their most likely patrol route. Emma shifted her shield and equipment to the new position, grateful for the countless hours of practice that had made such movements automatic even in challenging conditions. The shield's weight, which had once seemed overwhelming, now felt like a natural extension of her defensive capabilities. Private Marcus Thompson, a distant cousin of Sergeant Major Thompson who possessed similar skepticism about Emma's combat readiness, crouched nearby with his rifle trained on the compound. "This is taking too long," he muttered. "Bravo team should have made contact with Phoenix by now." The comment reflected tension that Emma could feel throughout their small unit. Real combat operations rarely proceed exactly according to plan, and the extended timeline suggested complications that could endanger both the extraction team and their overwatch position. Corporal Lisa Zong, who served as their communications specialist, monitored multiple radio frequencies while scanning for electronic surveillance from the compound. "I'm picking up increased radio chatter from inside the target area," she reported quietly. "Multiple voices, agitated tone. They might be aware of our presence." Emma felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Zong's report. If the terrorists knew they were under surveillance, the entire mission could deteriorate rapidly, from a covert extraction to open combat with superior numbers and defensive positioning favoring the enemy. "Morrison, this is Charlie 1, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez transmitted to the field commander. Communications specialist reports possible compromise. Recommend expedited extraction." Morrison's response carried the stress of a leader dealing with multiple complications simultaneously. "Copy, Charlie 1. Bravo team reports Phoenix location confirmed, but extraction complicated by additional security presence. Stand by for further instructions." The military euphemism "additional security presence" could mean anything from extra guards to a full defensive response that would trap Bravo team inside the compound. Emma studied the terrain between the target buildings, mentally calculating defensive positions and escape routes that might be needed if the mission deteriorated. Specialist Andrew Foster, who carried their heavy weapons system, noticed Emma's tactical assessment of the battlefield. "Rodriguez, you see something we should know about?" Emma hesitated before responding, aware that her observations might be dismissed as inexperienced speculation. "The compound layout creates natural choke points that could trap our people if they're discovered,
But those same choke points could be used defensively if we needed to cover their withdrawal. Foster studied the terrain with renewed interest, recognizing tactical insight that complemented his heavy weapons perspective. "Show me what you're seeing." Emma used her finger to trace lines of sight and movement across the landscape below them. If the Bravo team exits through the main compound entrance, they'll be exposed for 200 meters with no cover. But if they use the maintenance building route, we could provide overlapping fields of fire that would protect their movement. The analysis impressed Foster and Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, who realized that Emma's defensive training had given her a different perspective on battlefield geometry than their offensive-focused preparation had provided. "Zhang, relay Rodriguez's assessment to Morrison," Technical Sergeant Rodriguez ordered. "Alternative extraction route through maintenance building with Charlie Team fire support." Before Zhang could transmit the message, her equipment erupted with urgent communications from multiple sources. All teams, this is Alpha 1. We have multiple contacts approaching from the north. Estimate 15 to 20 individuals with automatic weapons. Bravo team, expedite extraction immediately." The situation was deteriorating exactly as Emma had feared. The terrorist cell had discovered their presence and was mobilizing a response that could overwhelm their small force through superior numbers and familiarity with local terrain. "Charlie Team, prepare for defensive positions," Technical Sergeant Rodriguez commanded. "We may need to provide covering fire for both Alpha and Bravo Team withdrawal." Emma's months of solitary training suddenly felt prophetic as she recognized that her defensive expertise was about to be tested under the most demanding conditions possible. The tactical shield that had been the source of so much humiliation during training was now essential equipment for protecting her fellow soldiers. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter with desperate urgency. "All teams, Phoenix extraction successful, but we're taking heavy fire. Multiple casualties. Charlie Team, we need immediate defensive support for emergency evacuation." The words "multiple casualties" hit Emma like a physical blow as she realized that soldiers she had trained with for months were wounded and depending on Charlie's team for survival. Her protective instincts, which had driven her relentless preparation, fully engaged as the theoretical became horrifyingly real. "Movement in the compound," Foster reported through his weapon scope. "Armed individuals deploying around the main buildings. They're setting up defensive positions." Emma could see muzzle flashes beginning to appear from windows and doorways in the compound as the terrorists established covering fire for their response teams. The tactical situation was developing exactly as her historical research had suggested. A smaller force trapped in unfavorable terrain, facing superior numbers with defensive advantages. "Zhang, get me a direct line to Morrison," Technical Sergeant Rodriguez ordered. "We need coordination for defensive fire support." Before Zhang could establish communication, the night erupted with the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar fire. Emma's training kicked in automatically as she recognized the sound that meant explosive death was arcing through the darkness toward their position. "Incoming! Take cover!" Technical Sergeant Rodriguez shouted as the first mortar round exploded 50 meters from their position, showering them with rock fragments and dirt. Emma pressed herself against her shield, feeling the concussion wave wash over their defensive position. The terrorists weren't just responding to their presence, they were conducting a coordinated attack designed to eliminate the American forces before they could escape with their extracted assets. A second mortar round landed closer, and Emma could hear shrapnel whistling overhead. Foster's heavy weapon opened fire toward the compound, his tracers creating bright streaks across the darkness as he tried to suppress the enemy mortar position. "Charlie Team, we need to move," Technical Sergeant Rodriguez commanded. "This position is zeroed for their mortars. We need new cover before they bracket us." Emma's mind raced through the tactical calculations she had studied during her historical research. Moving under mortar fire is extremely dangerous, but staying in a targeted position was certain death. However, relocating would temporarily reduce their ability to provide covering fire for the extraction teams that were depending on their support. "Sergeant, what if we don't all move?" Emma called out over the sound of incoming fire. "What if someone stays to maintain covering fire while the others relocate?" Technical Sergeant Rodriguez looked at her with surprise and concern. "Rodriguez, staying under mortar fire is suicide. Nobody could survive sustained bombardment in an exposed position."
Emma's response came from months of studying defensive tactics and understanding protection in ways that others hadn't considered. Not if you use mobile defense, not if you use the shield to create moving cover while providing suppressive fire. The concept was innovative and dangerous, requiring someone to remain in the targeted area while using tactical mobility to avoid direct hits while continuing to support their teammates. Foster understood the tactical value of Emma's suggestion, even as he recognized its extreme risk. Rodriguez, that would give us continuous fire support during relocation, but whoever stays behind would be taking incredible risks. I'll stay, Emma said immediately. I've been training for exactly this kind of defensive situation. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez studied Emma's determined expression and realized that her months of unconventional preparation might have created capabilities that their desperate situation required. The decision went against every protective instinct he felt toward the soldiers under his command, but tactical reality demanded innovative solutions. All right, Rodriguez, he decided, you maintain covering fire and mobile defense. We'll relocate and establish new positions to support you. Do not be a hero. If the situation becomes untenable, you move immediately.
Emma nodded her understanding while checking her equipment and ammunition. The shield modifications that Sergeant Phillips had quietly provided would be crucial for the mobile defense tactics she planned to employ. Her weeks of practicing movement patterns under stress were about to be tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. As Charlie's team began their tactical movement to new positions, Emma settled into the deadly dance of defensive combat that would determine whether her fellow soldiers lived or died. The mortar rounds continued falling around her position, but she had learned to read their patterns and timing in ways that allowed her to provide covering fire while avoiding direct impacts. Her rifle cracked repeatedly as she engaged targets in the compound, each shot carefully aimed to suppress enemy fire and protect the extraction teams that were fighting their way toward safety. The tactical shield moved with her like a protective partner, deflecting fragments and providing mobile cover that kept her alive while she maintained the desperate defense that her teammates required. What Emma couldn't know as she danced with death among the falling mortars was that her innovative defensive tactics were about to face the ultimate test. The terrorists had recognized the threat posed by her covering fire and were preparing a concentrated assault that would require every technique she had developed and every sacrifice she was willing to make to protect the soldiers depending on her courage. The mountain darkness echoed with the sounds of combat as Emma Rodriguez, the recruit who had been deemed combat worthless, prepared to prove that protection and sacrifice could take forms that traditional military training had never imagined. The distinctive metallic ping of grenades being armed echoed across the mountainside like a death knell as Emma Rodriguez recognized the sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. Through the scope mounted on her rifle, she could see 3 figures on the compound's eastern ridge, their arms drawn back in throwing positions that meant certain death for the cluster of wounded American soldiers taking shelter in the rocky depression below her position. "Grenades incoming!" Emma screamed into her headset, knowing that the warning alone wouldn't save the 30 soldiers who were trapped in what had become a natural killing zone. Alpha and Bravo teams had successfully extracted Phoenix and were moving toward the extraction point, but multiple casualties had slowed their progress to a crawl. The rocky depression that provided cover from small arms fire would become a death trap when explosive devices detonated within its confined space. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece with desperate urgency. "Charlie's team is 2 minutes out from supporting positions. Can you provide cover until we're in place?" Emma's eyes tracked the grenades arcing through the darkness, their trajectories calculated by her mind with the same precision she had applied to her historical research and tactical training. 3 explosive devices, each capable of killing or maiming every soldier within a 30-foot radius, were following ballistic paths that would converge on the exact location where her wounded comrades had sought safety. Time dilated into slow motion as Emma's months of unconventional training crystallized into perfect clarity. The tactical shield that had been her burden and humiliation was now the only thing standing between 30 American soldiers and certain death.
Her weeks of studying historical defensive tactics, her obsessive practice sessions, and her innovative understanding of protection suddenly revealed their purpose. Without conscious thought, Emma launched herself from her defensive position, her shield raised as she sprinted down the rocky slope toward the depression where her fellow soldiers lay helpless. The 40-pound tactical shield that had once seemed impossibly heavy now felt weightless as adrenaline and determination drove her past the limits of physical possibility. "Rodriguez, what are you doing?" Foster's voice carried a mixture of admiration and terror as he watched Emma's suicidal charge toward the incoming explosives. Emma didn't respond because she couldn't spare the breath or mental energy for explanation. Every fiber of her being was focused on the complex calculations required to intercept 3 grenades while protecting maximum numbers of soldiers with optimal positioning and minimal exposure to secondary explosions. The first grenade struck her shield with a metallic clang that reverberated through her bones. The impact nearly knocked her off balance, but Emma's months of practicing with unwieldy equipment had taught her to absorb and redirect force rather than fighting against it. She spun with the momentum, using the shield's surface to deflect the explosive device away from the clustered soldiers. Danny Walsh, who lay wounded with shrapnel in his leg, looked up in amazement as Emma appeared above the depression like an avenging angel. "Emma, get down! There are more coming!" The second grenade was already in the air, its trajectory aimed directly at the center of the rocky shelter where the most critically wounded soldiers were located. Emma's historical research into siege warfare had taught her that successful defense required sacrificing optimal positions to achieve necessary coverage. She threw herself sideways, extending her shield to its maximum reach while exposing herself to the blast effects. The grenade detonated against her shield's edge with a thunderous explosion that shook the mountain and sent shockwaves through Emma's entire body. The specially modified ballistic protection held, but the concussion wave lifted her off her feet and slammed her against the rocky wall with bone-jarring force. "Emma," Sarah Chen cried out from where she lay with a bullet wound in her shoulder, "you're going to get yourself killed." Emma struggled to her feet, blood streaming from cuts where rock fragments had found gaps in her protective gear. Her shield bore scorch marks and dents from the explosion, but the structural integrity remained intact thanks to the modifications that Sergeant Phillips had quietly provided during her months of preparation. The third grenade followed a different trajectory, lobbed higher to clear Emma's defensive positioning, and detonated directly above the soldiers in an airburst pattern that would maximize casualties. Emma's study of medieval siege tactics had included analysis of overhead attacks and the defensive measures required to counter them. With strength born of desperation and months of unconventional training, Emma raised her shield above her head and positioned herself directly under the incoming explosive. The shield's angle and her precise positioning would theoretically deflect the blast upward and outward, reducing its effectiveness against the soldiers below while concentrating the destructive force on her own position. "No, Emma, don't!" Ashley Morgan screamed as she realized what Emma was attempting. "You can't survive that!" The grenade struck the center of Emma's upraised shield and detonated in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire mountainside. The explosivity was deafening, a concussive wave that could be felt miles away, as the mountain itself seemed to shake with the force of the blast. Smoke and debris filled the air, creating a gray fog that obscured vision and made breathing difficult. For several heartbeats, silence dominated the battlefield as both American forces and terrorists processed what they had witnessed. Emma Rodriguez, the recruit who had been mocked for her inability to throw a practice grenade 20 feet, had just absorbed 3 explosive devices that would have killed every wounded soldier in the depression. When the smoke began to clear, the sight that emerged would be burned into the memory of every witness for the rest of their lives. Emma stood motionless in the center of the depression, her shield raised above her head like a medieval knight protecting a fallen comrade. Her uniform was torn and bloodied, her face blackened with soot and streaked with tears, but she remained upright and defiant. The shield that had been her constant companion and source of shame now bore the scars of her heroism. Dents and burn marks covered its surface, and one corner had been partially sheared away by the force of the explosions, but it had held. The ballistic protection had performed exactly as designed, absorbing and deflecting the explosive force that would have killed every soldier beneath it. "Medical, we need medical support immediately." Technical Sergeant Rodriguez's voice carried across the battlefield as Charlie's team finally reached positions where they could provide covering fire and assistance. Emma swayed on her feet, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the desperate defensive action beginning to fade as shock and physical trauma asserted themselves. Her ears rang from the explosions, her vision was blurred by blood and debris, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest from the abuse they had endured. "Emma, talk to me," Danny Walsh called out as he struggled to reach her despite his own wounds. "Are you okay?" Emma's response came out as barely a whisper, but every soldier in the depression heard her words clearly. "Is everyone alive? Did I get them all?" The question revealed the essence of Emma's character and the motivation that had driven her through months of preparation and moments of ultimate sacrifice. Her concern wasn't for her own condition or the pain she was experiencing, but for the welfare of the soldiers she had sworn to protect. "You got them all, Emma," Sarah Chen said through tears of gratitude and amazement. Specialist Foster, who had witnessed Emma's heroic defense through his weapon scope, later described it as the most incredible display of courage and tactical innovation he had ever seen. "She didn't just stop those grenades," he would tell investigators during the post-mission debrief. "She calculated trajectories, optimized positioning, and executed a defensive plan that saved 30 lives while risking her own." Medical Corpsman James Rivera reached Emma's position and began assessing her condition with professional efficiency. Despite the dramatic nature of her wounds and the trauma she had endured, Rivera's evaluation revealed that Emma's careful positioning and shield techniques had minimized her exposure to the worst effects of the explosions. Multiple lacerations, probable concussion, severe bruising, but no life-threatening injuries, Rivera reported. Her tactical positioning saved her life while she was saving everyone else's. The extraction proceeded with Emma being carried by her fellow soldiers, the same recruits who had once questioned her combat readiness, now competing for the honor of ensuring her safety. The shield that had defined her struggles and ultimate triumph was carefully retrieved and would later be analyzed by military engineers amazed at the innovative techniques Emma had developed. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been coordinating the overall mission, arrived at the extraction point as Charlie's team was loading wounded soldiers into evacuation helicopters. His first question was about Emma's condition, but his second revealed the broader implications of what had occurred. "How did Rodriguez know to position herself that way?" Morrison asked Technical Sergeant Rodriguez. "Those defensive techniques aren't part of standard training." The answer would emerge during extensive debriefings and analysis of Emma's unconventional preparation methods. Her months of studying historical defensive tactics, her innovative modifications to standard equipment, and her determination to prove herself had created capabilities that traditional military training had never considered. Sergeant Major Thompson, who arrived with the evacuation force, approached Emma's stretcher with an expression that combined amazement, humility, and something approaching reverence. The man who had dismissed her as combat worthless now faced the undeniable evidence of her extraordinary courage and effectiveness. "Rodriguez," Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying none of the dismissive authority that had characterized their previous interactions. "I owe you an apology. I owe everyone here an apology. I was wrong about what makes a soldier." Emma's response, delivered through pain medication and exhaustion, would become legendary among the personnel at Fort Carson. "Sergeant Major, you weren't wrong about what makes a soldier. You just couldn't see that soldiers come in different forms and that protection can look different than aggression." The helicopter flight back to Fort Carson carried 31 wounded but living American soldiers and one extracted intelligence asset whose information would prevent multiple terrorist attacks. Every life in that aircraft owed their survival to Emma Rodriguez, the recruit who had transformed weakness into strength and humility into heroism. As the Nevada desert appeared below them, bathed in the light of dawn that none of them had been certain they would see, Emma Rodriguez slipped into unconsciousness while clutching the shield that had been both her burden and her salvation. The girl who had been mocked for her failed grenade throw had become the woman who stopped grenades with her body and will, proving that true strength often appears in forms that the world isn't prepared to recognize. The mountain behind them held the bodies of terrorists whose plans had been thwarted by American courage and innovation. But more importantly, it held the memory of a moment when one small woman's determination to protect others had redefined what it meant to be a warrior in the modern world. 6 months after the mountain operation that would forever change military training doctrine, Emma Rodriguez stood in the Pentagon briefing room facing an assembly of generals, defense contractors, and strategic analysts who had gathered to understand how one recruit's innovative approach to defense had revolutionized their conception of modern warfare. The scars on her hands from that night had faded, but the confidence in her bearing reflected a transformation that went far deeper than physical healing.
General Patricia Hendricks, who had commanded the mission that brought Emma to national attention, introduced her to the distinguished audience with words that would have seemed impossible during her early days at Fort Carson. Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Rodriguez developed defensive techniques that not only saved 30 American lives, but provided tactical innovations that are now being integrated into training programs across all branches of the military. Emma's promotion to sergeant had come with unprecedented speed, accompanied by the Bronze Star Medal for heroic achievement and recommendations for advanced tactical training that recognized her unique capabilities. However, the most significant changes had occurred not in her rank or decorations, but in the military's understanding of how diverse approaches to combat could enhance overall effectiveness. The briefing room's large screen displayed tactical analysis of Emma's shield defense, breaking down her positioning, timing, and equipment modifications into components that could be studied and replicated. Defense Department analysts had spent months reconstructing the sequence of events, their findings revealing innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about defensive warfare. Dr. Alexandra Mitchell, the Pentagon's lead researcher on tactical innovation, presented data that validated Emma's unconventional training methods. Sergeant Rodriguez's approach to mobile shield defense represents a paradigm shift in how we think about protection in combat environments. Her techniques allow smaller forces to provide defensive coverage that traditional methods couldn't achieve. The presentation included footage from the mountain operation, captured by helmet cameras and surveillance equipment that documented Emma's heroic defense in detail that still amazed viewers months later. The video showed her calculating trajectories, positioning herself optimally, and executing defensive maneuvers that saved lives through precise application of physics and tactical innovation. Colonel Benjamin Foster, who had been assigned to develop new training programs based on Emma's methods, addressed the strategic implications of her discoveries. What Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated is that defensive specialization can be as valuable as offensive capability. We're now training defensive specialists who can protect larger units while allowing traditional forces to focus on their primary missions. Emma listened to the presentations with a mixture of pride and humility, understanding that her personal journey from mockery to recognition represented broader changes in how the military identified and developed unconventional talent. Her story had become a case study in the importance of recognizing potential that didn't fit standard patterns. Following the formal presentations, Emma was invited to address the assembly personally. Her words reflected the wisdom gained through struggle and the perspective that came from proving herself under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Respected leaders," Emma began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced her earlier uncertainty. What happened on that mountain wasn't the result of superhuman abilities or miraculous intervention. It was the product of understanding that protection can take many forms and that strength isn't always measured by traditional standards. She gestured toward the tactical displays showing her shield modifications and defensive positioning. "Every technique I used that night came from months of studying historical examples, experimenting with equipment, and refusing to accept that my limitations made me worthless. The military strength comes from diversity of thought and approach, not from conformity to a single model of effectiveness." General Robert Patterson, the Army Chief of Staff, asked the question that had been central to all subsequent analysis of Emma's actions. "Sergeant Rodriguez,
How do we identify and develop other soldiers who might possess similar unconventional capabilities? Emma's response revealed the depth of thinking that emerged from her transformation from struggling recruit to recognized expert. Sir, I believe we need to look beyond physical specifications and traditional performance metrics to identify soldiers who think differently about problems. The military's greatest assets might be people who approach challenges from angles that standard training doesn't consider. Her recommendation led to the establishment of the Alternative Tactics Development Program, which sought to identify recruits whose unconventional approaches to military problems might yield innovative solutions. Emma had been assigned as the program's first instructor, tasked with developing training methods that could cultivate defensive innovation rather than simply teaching standardized techniques. The program's early results had exceeded all expectations. Recruits who struggled with traditional combat training were demonstrating remarkable aptitude for specialized defensive roles that enhanced unit effectiveness in ways that previous doctrine hadn't imagined. Emma's experience had proven that the military's strength could be multiplied by embracing diverse approaches to common challenges. Private Jennifer Williams, one of Emma's first students in the new program, exemplified the potential that could be unlocked through alternative training methods. Williams had been considered unsuitable for combat roles due to her small stature and quiet demeanor, but under Emma's instruction, she developed defensive techniques that allowed her to protect entire squads during urban warfare exercises. Sergeant Rodriguez taught me that my size wasn't a limitation if I learned to use positioning and equipment in ways that maximized protective coverage. I can create defensive zones that allow my teammates to operate more effectively because they know they have reliable protection. Emma's influence extended beyond tactical innovation to broader changes in military culture and recognition of diverse forms of excellence. Her story had become required study for officers learning about leadership and talent development, emphasizing the importance of recognizing potential that didn't conform to traditional expectations. Sergeant Major Thompson, whose initial dismissal of Emma had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of premature judgment, had requested assignment to the Alternative Tactics Program as part of his own professional development. His transformation from skeptic to advocate demonstrated the broader cultural changes that Emma's success had generated. Working with Sergeant Rodriguez has taught me that my job as a leader isn't to force soldiers into predetermined molds. My responsibility is to identify each soldier's unique strengths and help them develop those capabilities in service to the mission. The relationship between Emma and Thompson had evolved into mutual respect and collaboration that transcended their initial conflict. Thompson's experience and traditional military knowledge combined with Emma's innovative thinking to create training approaches that were both grounded in proven doctrine and open to creative adaptation. Captain Martinez, who had supported Emma's research efforts during her darkest period of self-doubt, had been promoted to oversee the military's new emphasis on intellectual diversity and alternative problem-solving approaches. Her work built on Emma's example to identify and develop other forms of unconventional military talent. Emma's success demonstrated that the military's intellectual resources were being underutilized, Martinez explained, during a conference on military education reform. We were discarding valuable capabilities because they didn't fit our preconceived notions about what military excellence should look like.
The changes extended to recruitment and assessment procedures that now included evaluations for defensive aptitude, innovative thinking, and protective instincts alongside traditional measures of combat readiness. Emma's influence had created pathways for military service that accommodated diverse forms of patriotic commitment and tactical capability. Emma's family had watched her transformation with pride and amazement that reflected their own journey from concern about her military service to recognition of her extraordinary contributions. Maria Rodriguez, who had initially feared for her daughter's safety, now understood that Emma's protective instincts had found their perfect expression in military service. Mija has always been someone who puts herself between problems and people who might get hurt, Maria told reporters during a feature story about Emma's success. I worried that the military would break her spirit, but instead, it gave her the tools to protect people on a scale I never imagined. Carlos Rodriguez, Emma's younger brother, had been inspired by his sister's example to pursue his own military career, though his interests lay in military engineering rather than defensive tactics. His decision reflected the broader influence of Emma's story on young people who saw military service as an opportunity to contribute unique capabilities to national defense. Emma showed me that the military needs all kinds of people and all kinds of thinking, Carlos explained during his own recruitment interview. She proved that you don't have to fit a stereotype to serve your country effectively. The intelligence gathered during the mission that had made Emma famous continued to yield benefits for national security. Phoenix, the extracted informant, had provided information that prevented multiple terrorist attacks and led to the disruption of several international terror networks. Emma's heroic defense had protected not only the soldiers in her immediate vicinity, but countless civilians who would have been victims of prevented attacks. Lieutenant Morrison, who had commanded the extraction mission, frequently referenced Emma's actions when discussing the broader implications of tactical innovation and adaptive leadership. His reports emphasized that military success often depended on personnel who could think beyond standard procedures when circumstances demanded creative solutions. Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated that the most valuable soldiers aren't always those who follow orders perfectly, Morrison wrote in his analysis of the mission. Sometimes military excellence requires people who can innovate under pressure and find solutions that doctrine doesn't anticipate. Emma's speaking engagements at military academies and training facilities across the country had made her a recognized advocate for inclusive approaches to military service and talent development. Her presentations emphasized themes of perseverance, innovation, and the importance of recognizing diverse forms of strength. Every person who chooses to serve has something valuable to contribute, Emma told a group of new recruits during a recent visit to Fort Carson. Your job isn't to become someone else's idea of what a soldier should be. Your job is to become the best version of yourself in service to something larger than your individual interests. The tactical shield that had been both Emma's burden and salvation was now displayed in the Pentagon's Museum of Military Innovation, accompanied by a detailed explanation of the defensive techniques that had saved 30 lives. The exhibit served as a reminder that military effectiveness often came from unexpected sources and unconventional approaches. Technical Sergeant Kim, who had recognized Emma's potential during her earliest training struggles, had been assigned to work with defense contractors developing new protective equipment based on her innovations. The collaboration between Emma's tactical insights and advanced engineering was producing defensive systems that enhance protection for military personnel in various combat environments. Emma's understanding of how to use protection equipment efficiently has led to designs that are more effective and more adaptable than anything we've produced before, Kim explained during a demonstration of new tactical shields. Her experience proved that user innovation can drive technological advancement in ways that laboratory testing alone cannot achieve. The broader implications of Emma's story extended beyond military applications to questions about how society identifies and develops unconventional talent. Educational institutions, corporations, and other organizations had begun studying her example as a model for recognizing potential that didn't fit traditional patterns. Dr. Rodriguez, the child psychologist who had worked with gifted military children and had no relation to Emma despite sharing her surname, published research using Emma's case to demonstrate the importance of alternative assessment methods for identifying exceptional capabilities. Dr. Rodriguez wrote in her influential paper on talent identification, "Organizations that expand their understanding of excellence will discover capabilities that their competitors overlook." As Emma concluded her Pentagon briefing and prepared to return to her training responsibilities, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from humiliating failure to recognized innovation. The path had been difficult and often painful, but it had led to discoveries about herself and about military service that would benefit countless others. The recruit who had once been dismissed as combat worthless had become proof that true worth often lies hidden beneath surface appearances, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal its full potential.
Emma Rodriguez has shown that strength comes in many forms, that innovation can emerge from struggle, and that the most valuable contributions often come from those who refuse to accept limitations that others consider permanent. The Nevada desert surrounding Fort Carson stretched endlessly toward horizons that no longer seemed impossible to reach. Emma Rodriguez, now Sergeant Rodriguez, looked forward to continuing her work developing the next generation of innovative defenders, confident that her example would inspire others to find their own unconventional paths to excellence in service of their country and their fellow citizens. Her story had become more than personal triumph. It had become evidence that American strength lies not in conformity to single standards of excellence, but in the diversity of capabilities that emerge when people are given opportunities to contribute their unique gifts to common purposes. The girl who couldn't throw a grenade 20 feet had become the woman who stopped grenades with her shield and will, proving that heroism often wears faces that the world isn't prepared to recognize until circumstances demand the very qualities that had been overlooked and undervalued. The ripple effects of Emma's transformation continued to expand across international military communities as allied nations sought to understand and implement her defensive innovations. NATO training exercises now include modules based on her techniques, with military advisors from 12 countries studying her methods for application in their own defensive doctrines.
General François Dubois of the French Armed Forces had personally requested demonstrations of Emma's shield techniques during joint training operations. Sergeant Rodriguez has revolutionized our understanding of individual defensive capabilities, Dubois stated during multinational military conferences. Her innovations provide tactical advantages that we are integrating into European defensive strategies. The international recognition brought Emma opportunities to consult on defensive fortification projects and urban warfare scenarios across multiple continents. Her expertise in protection dynamics had applications beyond traditional military contexts, extending to law enforcement, emergency response, and civilian security operations. Detective Captain Susan Hayes of the Los Angeles Police Department had implemented Emma's positioning techniques in SWAT team training, adapting military defensive concepts for urban law enforcement situations. Sergeant Rodriguez's approach to using protective equipment efficiently has improved our capability to protect officers and civilians during high-risk operations, Hayes reported during police training seminars. Emma's influence on emergency response protocols had saved lives in civilian contexts as well. Firefighter Battalion Chief Michael O'Connor credited Emma's defensive positioning concepts with improving rescue operations in collapsed building scenarios. Her understanding of how to create protective zones using available equipment has enhanced our ability to shield rescue workers while they extract trapped civilians, O'Connor explained. The private security industry had also embraced Emma's innovations, with companies specializing in executive protection and facility security incorporating her techniques into their training programs. Corporate security consultant Rachel Moore developed certification programs based on Emma's methods, creating new career pathways for individuals who possessed protective instincts but lacked traditional security backgrounds. Emma Rodriguez proved that the most effective protection often comes from people who think differently about security challenges, Moore stated during industry conferences. We're now identifying and training protective specialists who might have been overlooked using conventional assessment methods. Academic institutions had begun offering courses in tactical innovation and unconventional military thinking, using Emma's story as a central case study in adaptive leadership and creative problem-solving. Professor Daniel Chen at the Naval War College developed an entire curriculum around identifying and developing non-traditional military capabilities. Sergeant Rodriguez's experience demonstrates that military effectiveness depends on intellectual diversity and willingness to challenge conventional approaches, Professor Chen explained to his students. Future military leaders must learn to recognize and cultivate capabilities that don't fit standard categories.
Emma's memoir, titled Shield of Courage: Finding Strength in Unexpected Places, had become a bestseller among military personnel and civilians interested in stories of perseverance and innovation. The book's proceeds were donated to programs supporting veterans with non-traditional military specialties and organizations helping military families cope with unconventional career paths. Literary critic and military historian Dr. Sarah Washington praised Emma's writing for its honest portrayal of struggle and transformation. Rodriguez has created more than a military memoir. She's written a guide for anyone who has ever felt that their unique capabilities weren't recognized or valued by conventional systems. The book tour had taken Emma to universities, military academies, and corporate conferences, where her message of recognizing diverse forms of excellence resonated with audiences far beyond military circles. Her appearances at high schools in underserved communities particularly emphasized that unconventional paths to success often began with refusing to accept others' limitations. Emma's relationship with her hometown of Los Angeles had evolved as well, with the city recognizing her achievements through honorary ceremonies and community programs. Mayor Jennifer Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared surname, presented Emma with the key to the city during a celebration that emphasized the importance of supporting young people whose talents might not fit traditional expectations. Mayor Rodriguez declared during the ceremony, "Emma Rodriguez represents the best of what our city produces. She shows that greatness can emerge from any neighborhood when determination meets opportunity and when communities support unconventional dreams." The community center where Emma had first learned tactical concepts from Lieutenant Colonel Foster had been renamed the Rodriguez Center for Youth Development, focusing on programs that identified and nurtured diverse forms of talent among at-risk young people. Foster, now retired, served as the center's director while implementing Emma's philosophies about recognizing potential in unexpected places. Emma's example shows these kids that their unique perspectives and capabilities have value. We're not trying to make them fit predetermined molds. We're helping them discover how their individual strengths can contribute to larger purposes. Emma's younger brother, Carlos, had graduated from military engineering school and was now working on projects that incorporate his sister's defensive innovations into permanent fortification designs. His engineering thesis, Adaptive Protection Systems Based on Individual Tactical Innovation, had received recognition from defense contractors interested in next-generation defensive technologies. Emma taught me that the best engineering solutions often come from understanding how people actually use equipment in real-world situations, Carlos explained during defense industry presentations. The research applications of Emma's defensive techniques had extended into medical and disaster response fields as well. Emergency room physician Dr. Maria Santos had adapted Emma's positioning concepts for medical triage situations, using similar principles to maximize protective coverage for medical personnel during mass casualty events. Sergeant Rodriguez's understanding of how to create protective zones using available resources has applications in medical emergency response, Dr. Santos reported during medical conferences. International humanitarian organizations had also incorporated Emma's defensive principles into their safety protocols for workers in conflict zones. The Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders had developed training programs based on her innovations, teaching civilian aid workers how to create protective positions using available equipment and terrain. As Emma prepared for her next assignment training defensive specialists at the newly established Innovation Command at Fort Bragg, she reflected on how her personal journey had become part of a larger transformation in military thinking and societal recognition of diverse capabilities. The fort's commanding officer, General Patricia Williams, had specifically requested Emma's assignment to lead the development of unconventional tactics programs. Sergeant Rodriguez represents the future of military innovation, Williams stated during Emma's welcome ceremony. Her experience proves that our greatest strategic advantages will come from people who think differently about traditional problems.
Emma's new position involved not just training individual soldiers, but developing institutional approaches that could identify and cultivate innovative thinking across all military specialties. Her work would influence how the military recruited, trained, and utilized personnel whose capabilities didn't fit conventional categories. The evening sun cast long shadows across the training grounds at Fort Bragg as Emma Rodriguez, now recognized as one of the military's leading experts on defensive innovation, prepared to begin the next chapter of her service. Her journey from ridiculed recruit to respected leader had proven that strength, courage, and military excellence could take forms that tradition had never imagined, opening pathways for future generations of unconventional warriors to serve their country through the unique gifts that made them different, not deficient. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.